What I'd like everybody to do tonight is go through probably a fifth of the questions, if you can, of the review. I know that's a lot of practice questions, if you can, but at least go through. What was that?
What page is it? Like it's just.
Yeah, just keep going through them.
Okay, so we got that.
And the main reason I would like everybody to do that, if you don't mind, is so then we can go through any questions that you have questions on, and then basically go through explanations, because there are a lot of questions in that area. And I usually don't do it the first day, for the main reason is it gives people enough time to look through it and become familiar with it. Again, they're not going to be domain to domain. It's going to be a mixture of all 10 domains within there. But, and again, it's not going to be 100% accurate for the test, because then that would be copyright infringement and all that fun stuff. But it's going to be the same type of content, such as like the Bell-LaPadula, because chances are you'll see that on the test, even if it's just the name of somebody's dog. Bell-LaPadula bit so-and-so. What's the potential liability? Did they show their due care and due diligence in the situation?
Some of them they give the explanation, others it's just the answer.
Because they probably couldn't find the books or the resources to prove it.
They ran out of time.
Yeah. With the CCSEC or eSite, you'll come across the same thing. The majority of them have either at least one resource, potentially multiple resources, saying this is why we think this potential content would be this way. But you'll come across some that have no explanation, and you're like, what? But okay, within security management, some of the important things, again, are going to be all the way from a component of a security program through information classification, and of course, your information security awareness training. This is probably going to be your biggest bang for your buck, or your cheapest way. Have somebody make little posters that say, don't write your password down on a piece of paper. And then have, yeah, don't put it on your keyboard. Don't put it in your wallet. Don't put it in a text file on your desktop. When somebody calls, don't give it to them over the phone. That's a big issue as well. Yeah. I had a colleague that he spent a little bit more than most people do for a pen test, but this is relatively soon when the Zargus came out. That was kind of like a PDA, but it ran Linux. And he gave, what was it, half a dozen to C-level execs. And of course, they had backdoors on their system. And the organization's policy was no USB devices on the network, period. But they send these nice devices, which were about $200 a pop to individuals. And almost instantly, half of them were plugged directly into the computer. Of course, it backdoored the system, and that was a huge finding as far as the social engineering. And they tacked that to an expense to the actual pen test, which is pretty good. But I hate to say it, a lot of times the C-level execs do have less time on their hands to actually do the same training as everybody else does. Or their entire mindset's off because they have to run a business, so a lot of times they don't think about some of the basics. So that's another real big reason why you need to push information security awareness training. Okay, know the definitions: vulnerability, threat, risk, exposure. These are basically, bless you, some things that you will come across. The CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I know a lot of people also put in authorization in there, or authentication. As far as ITSEC squared goes, it's availability. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. There's also a push to have 6, basically 2 triads put on top of each other. So you have, instead of a triad, a star. But this is for ITSEC squared. Your control types: administrative, technical, and physical. Again, your administrative is going to be your policies and procedures. Your technical, it's going to be anything technical, such as firewalls, access control lists, items like that. And physical controls, your fences, even lighting or fire suppression. Okay, again, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Defense in depth, everybody comfortable with that? Or security in layers? It's one of the biggest concepts in security is that you don't just have one hurdle to jump. If you have multiple hurdles, hopefully the bad guy will trip on one of them and you can catch him in time. For example, a honeypot. How many people here have heard of that before? Good old honeypot. Some people are pushing that it's an entrapment but technicality, it's not entrapment because you're not going out and soliciting, hey, hack this site. What ends up happening is it's more enticement. So you're putting something up there which is looks like an extremely vulnerable system, which the bad guy's hopefully going to hit that one and then spend all their time there as opposed to the real servers. And then if you, especially if legal's looking at it or law enforcement, they can now track it back and say, okay, you're the bad guy, you just hacked into their system. Basically the hand in the cookie jar issue. I've also seen and used honeypots on the internal network because the main reason why you do that is because if anybody touches that honeypot, that's a security violation. Unless they're authorized security individuals doing scans. Because either A, somebody internally is doing a scan on the network to see what's up, what's running, or malware has been installed somewhere on the network and scanning for itself, looking for valid hosts to attack. So if you do have a pop or two, or let's say 2 or 3 honeypots throughout the network internally, yeah, if they get hit, that could potentially be a problem, and it usually is a problem. Okay. Again, enterprise management expectations, you're looking to mitigate risk to an acceptable level. And again, it comes back down to the countermeasure should never be more expensive than the asset value or the asset's worth. User productivity, you want to make the item as seamless as possible. Granted, usernames and passwords are going to add another layer of actually doing something. But if you make it to where, for example, it's a single sign-on, but you're authenticating, let's say, every minute or so, it's going to make it to where the individual, if they're not doing any traffic, may have to go through a specific step or hurdle. I have had an issue to where, for example, they did a single sign-on for a network, so it's the same username and password everywhere. But to get onto the internet, then you had to put in your username and password again to bypass the firewall. Or not firewall, but the proxy server. What ended up happening with that aspect, a lot of people complained because they kept having to put in their username and password to surf stuff they shouldn't have been surfing to begin with. But the primary reason it was there was to prevent unauthorized programs from accessing the internet. So unfortunately, in that space, it was turned off. So then it went to a true single sign-on. If they're authenticated, then they're automatically authenticated to the proxy. Again, communications, you want to speak at the same level or the same language if at all possible. For example, with forensics, they try to teach you that whenever you're in court, you're supposed to speak at the same level the jury and the judge would understand. So you need to stop talking the technical talk and start talking the way that a normal individual, for example, like a buffer overflow, as opposed to saying you're overwriting memory segments and then you're looking for the EIP, which is the return pointer, to control the application. Say things like buffer overflows, very bad, very bad. Okay, senior management down to staff. You want to go top down because if you go bottom up, it's going to be a lot more work. It's going to take a lot more time. And then once you get to the top, if they don't back you, then it's all going to fall apart. So if you go from the top level, senior management, and say, this is what we suggest, since they're the owners of the system, they're the ones that are going to be ultimately responsible for when it fails. So as long as they say, yes, it's okay, again, politically speaking, the middle management is going to go to the senior management and say, okay, this is what they told us to do. Since I don't want to get fired, I'm going to do it. And then it's just going to be easier from there. Okay, policy types. We will cover this more in the laws, ethics, and investigation section. But basically, organizational policies, you go through business needs, laws, regulations, and standards of due care and due diligence. You need to know the difference between regulatory, advisory, and information or informative. ISO, the 2700 series, is definitely a good thing to know. It's basically the international standard. And it's international. So if you're going for example like the FISMA, that's only going to be probably US centric for a specific industry segment. If you do the ISO 2700 series, what's going to end up happening is now what you have here that's secure is going to have the same security over the UK or anywhere else in the world. Because again, it's international. So it may be pushed as well, especially on a test. I definitely try to read up on or memorize that the ISO is the international standard. Know the difference between policies through procedures. Policies, your 30,000 foot overview. So it's going to be the whole part that antivirus must exist on the system. And then what you have it is the all the way down to the procedures. This is the specific antivirus that's going to be on there and when it's going to be updated, how it's going to be maintained, or how it's going to be used. So again, each one's going to become more and more granular.
Question.
Yes?
Earlier on the ISO 227002, you said basically read through it versus what's like in the Sean Harris book?
Or, yeah, if you come across anything on there, just definitely the main thing to know is that it is the international standard and it's more stringent. It's basically, it's more encompassing, which makes it more expensive to do. But if you follow that standard, then you should be good for the most part in the US and then again in the UK and then so forth. But if you're in a specific industry segment, if you follow that, you're going to have the majority of it done. So then you may have to add a couple things here and there for the US portion. Because again, with international law and regulation, that's a whole new sticky issue. Like again, with the EU Privacy Act, there's certain things that you can do here that you can't do over there. But yeah, just know that that's the standard, or sorry, the international standard that a lot of people are following. And it's based off like the British standard 7799, which then they made the international standard 17799. So that's basically the same thing. This is just the evolution of it. Okay, this is very important to know. Data owner, they are responsible for the classification. System owner is responsible for the computer systems. The data custodian is the maintenance individual that makes sure that the data is up to date or working. Then user is the person who routinely uses the information. So the system owner and the data owner can be the same entity, but they want you to differentiate between both because they can be separated as well. What would be an example of an environment where that would happen? Where data owner is not the system owner? Say if you have, you're doing research and development with a vendor, and the vendor has trade secret information that they're allowing you to look at for specs to integrate with an application that they have. They are going to be the data owner of that data that you have a control of, and then of course that's going to reside on your system, so you're going to need to protect it as such. The trick for that, or actually the downfall from that aspect, again, like I mentioned before, if you have a vendor or an upstream provider or a third party that communicates with you or whatnot, you basically have to be enforcing their standards of security are equal to your own, because when it comes down to it, even if you have a third-party service provider, let's say they're co-locating your data or housing your data off-site, if it gets damaged, when it comes down to it, your name's still associated with that data. So you're still going to have some sort of liability. Even if it's not legal liability, it's going to be in the public eye that it's your data that got compromised. For example, there was information from a large bank a couple years ago. They sent a bunch of tape backups through one of the courier services, and the courier service lost the tapes. So unfortunately, even though it was the courier service's fault that the tapes were lost in transit or stolen in transit, they weren't able to tell. What ended up happening is the financial organization actually got a black eye because of it. Okay, again, value data, classify information, put a security label on the information. If it's going to be trade secret, then you have to classify it as such. If you don't, then you cannot go after somebody. What was it?
Get damages.
Yeah, you cannot get damages if it was compromised. Yeah. Like with that, again, the Economic Espionage Act, they say if a trade secret is stolen and sold, and somebody basically makes a profit off of it, if it's just stolen, then it doesn't qualify for the Economic Espionage Act. But if it's stolen and sold, or there's profit generated, or other sorts of items generated, such as somebody steals content from target A and then goes to work with target B, that in effect is gaining from the theft of the previous service. So it's still financial. Then also decide on controls. Basically just something to memorize. At SBU, you'll also have FOUO depending on the world you live in. And unfortunately, this is a very variable world in information security, so the classification levels may be different. So you just need to know that top secret's higher than unclassified type scenario.
Really?
Yeah, you should know that. Some people have a problem with it, though. Confidential, again, is going to be very similar. It's not trade secret, but it's something that shouldn't be associated with anybody else. Then trade secret information, of course, is going to be your bread and butter of the organization. Same type of scenario as the previous. Depends on how much damage it could cause to national security is what classification level the information is going to be. Same type information here. Depending on how much damage to the organization is going to happen if a competitor gets the information or it's released to the public is how much you're going to have to classify it. For example, if you're working on a flagship product, a piece of software, and the source code or the design specs go out onto the internet or get stolen, sold to somebody else, they are first to market, then it could basically mean that your entire organization fails at that point. So you should have classified that as a trade secret rather than public. Okay, again, very important to know. You may only have a question or two covering the differences between due care and due diligence, but it's basically something that it's going to resonate through many of the different domains, and it's going to go throughout many different questions as well. As far as due care, you're doing what you're supposed to do, and due diligence is you're validating that everything's working properly. Get everybody comfortable with risk management. I know there's basically an entire domain specifically for that, but risk management is you know that you cannot eliminate 100% risk, so you're managing it. So if anything does change, for example, in the environment, you go from one operating system, upgrade it to another operating system, and it either is going to break software because the API calls have changed, or there's a bug in the new TCP/IP stack, or something strange is going to happen, which was unforeseen when you went to the next OS. With risk management, basically makes it to where you're constantly monitoring for that. For example, going back to Millworm, that's a relatively good way of doing risk management as well, is you see what's actually out there, what's vulnerable, what exploits are out there. So when people say that we shouldn't have to patch until next week, you can say, well, the exploit already exists, I have it here, you really do need to patch. There's no option. Okay. Risk analysis team, again, the person doing the risk assessment. Within a risk assessment, it's not just your qualitative, quantitative analysis. It could also be your vulnerability scans or other type of items. Who here has heard of the NSA's IAM, IEM? Basically, those are certifications for information assurance methodology and information assurance assessment methodology and information security evaluation methodology, which basically means that the IAM is a white team, the IEM is a blue team assessment, and they've been debating on whether or not to go red team due to legal issues, because if they go red team, then they're advocating hacking. But what it comes down to is they have built-in capabilities within a risk assessment team because they're validating all known potential risks or threats. And how many people know the difference between a red team and a blue team? From a white team perspective, it's a hands-off internal assessment. So you're going through the policies, procedures, making sure, basically it's an audit or hands-off audit. But it's pre-audit because you're not going to ding anybody for anything. You're just trying to find the gaps in their security posture. With the blue team, same type of scenario. It's going to be a hands-on attack. Sometimes you may pretend to be a disgruntled employee, but you're from within the organization trying to find any and all vulnerabilities that you can possibly find, which would also take in consideration your vulnerability scans. From the red team perspective is you don't have internal access. You're pretending to be an actual enemy. You get in somehow, which could be either A, get a job inside the organization and then attack from there, or just do internet scans, try to attack from there, do phone calls, social engineering, any way that you can think to attack the organization from basically your attacker or competitor's perspective. I've seen some really interesting information on sites like, of course, Career Builder, Monster, Dice, from the HR perspective, is that if they have 100 job openings in the IT sector, IT area, and they're all Windows-related jobs, chances are the majority of the systems are going to be Windows. But if they're looking for Unix admins that have, say, Python experience, you know that that technology is probably going to be used as well. So it may help grow the things that you're going to attack or the things you need to assess during your risk analysis.
Is another way to kind of define the difference between blue and red is that red actually exploits the vulnerabilities that are found?
Yeah, you're trying to get in. Yes. And then another issue with that is, with a red team, if you find one thing you get in, you're done. The game's over. You've successfully penetrated the organization. With the blue team, a lot of times, depending on the scope of the project, usually you don't try to exploit it at all. Usually it's this user has access to these items, and if they were disgruntled, they should be able to get in here. Sometimes you can go as far as trying to do reverse engineering on things that are known to be within inside the organization, and then see if you can find things. But usually it's you don't do the exploit, and you have internal access, and then you try to find everything possible or everything on your list of things to do. With the red team, it's you get in once, you're good to go. So red teams can be a lot easier, but they can also be a lot harder in some aspects. Because again, usually people don't know that a red team is actually attacking. With a blue team, they usually do because they have to get special access ports on the switch, user accounts built, and things like that. So there's also the knowledge difference and where they're coming from.
Do you pay a bonus if you get in? Or is that incentive to be green?
Unfortunately, no. Most of the red team guys that I know are pen testers. It's a pride thing. So we usually kick ourselves really hard if we can't get in.
What industries are targeted?
For what? For example, like PCI, you have to do red team assessments on the websites. So that's more of a targeted.
But don't the companies hire
Yes.
people to do that? So they
Yes.
know.
These are things where, back to the get out of jail free card, the owner of the system has to give authorization for anybody to attack it. If they don't, then it's usually state sponsored or whatever, to where another entity is trying to illegally either get information from a target or try to down the target. I had a colleague that was dealing with a case. What ended up happening was this software company was DOS'd, and they kept getting DOS'd. It kept going down, and it took them about 2.5 days to come back up. Well, further investigation, and because some of their contacts they were able to find out that, I believe it was some organizations and cyber cafes within Turkey. This is where the attacks were coming from. But this other software company was paying these people to go to the cyber cafe and start doing these attacks to this other company. The main reason they were doing that is because they wanted to get a contract and give the other company such a black eye that they wouldn't win the contract. These people were second in line to get the contract for a little bit less. So company B only spent probably $20,000 or $30,000, and it cost company A over $1 million in downtime, investigation, and things like that. So economic espionage or corporate espionage does happen a lot. How many people have heard of the Beltway Bandit scenario? Basically, a Beltway Bandit is somebody who jumps from job to job here in the DC area, in the Beltway. I've seen in the information security realm, especially, somebody be hired at one company, ask for a raise, and then what ends up happening is they say we won't give you a raise. The cost of living is all we'll give you or less. So they say, okay, they put their resume out there, go to work for the competitor. Yeah, I'm usually making, let's say, 10 to 30% more. And then a year later, there's a job opening at the organization that they just left, jump back, making sometimes 50% or double what they were making previously. So it's one of the scenarios to where the organization just gave the 7% raise as opposed to the only offering 1 or 2, then they probably would have saved a good 40% off the guy's salary. But that's actually relatively common in the IT sector. The attrition rate.
In sales more?
What was it?
Is that more in sales or just in...
No, the IT, the pillar heads are bad about this. You'll see, compared to other industries, from what I've seen, is that the attrition rate's more so than your average. For example, like if you work in a mill, half the people there are going to work there for half their life or their whole life until they retire. Lived up in Montana and had that situation where there was a mill and a lot of people worked there for a long period of time, 20 years or so.
Did you turn it back on?
Yeah, it's on. Is it on?
Yeah, it's up.
Okay, cool. But then it came back to, like in the IT sector, I've seen a lot of times to where once you hit your 3-year period, you're old, so it's time to move on. I've seen that mentality a lot, is that very few people last more than 2 to 3 years. But then, of course, you see other individuals that will stay at an organization still for 10, 15 years from when it's first built or whatnot all the way through. But yeah, there's also the good old pirates of Silicon Valley, that type of scenario. Even made a movie about Bill Gates and Jobs. But okay, vulnerabilities. This one right here, it's not always obvious, but lack of security understanding is one of the biggest things in going back to social engineering. So basically understand that security awareness helps fix that. Not 100%, but it's still going to help people understand what type of things can be a problem. You need to know the difference between potential risk and delayed risk or residual risk. Quantitative versus qualitative. Well, what's the difference between qualitative versus quantitative? Yep. Quantitative is numeric based, so you have actual numbers to put to it. And then qualitative is opinion based. Delphi method is a common way of doing qualitative. It's basically just something to know. Okay, this math, especially depending on what test you'll do after this, or if you're management or not, memorize the ALE. Here's a single loss expectancy is the asset value times exposure factor. And ALE is the asset value times exposure factor times the annualized rate of occurrence. So you need to know the algorithm for it by heart really badly. What was that? Yes, and it will. Okay, the ARO, the annual rate of occurrence. Again, if it happens once a year, it's 1. If it happens twice a year, it's going to be 2. If it happens once every 10 years, it's 0.1. So it comes down to it. Again, makes the math a little bit easier, but you do not want the countermeasure to be more than the ARO or the ALE of the item. Yeah, cost is not just the quantitative, but the damages that will happen during the time it takes to bring the asset back up, the time lost it's going to take to for future productivity, and then also potential sales in the future as well. For example, I hate to bring back up the TJ Maxx scenario, they probably have lost a lot of future sales because of the loss of credit cards. Okay, mitigate risk versus accepting and rejecting. Does not look, okay, transferring is not on there, but mitigates, you put some sort of countermeasure in there. So you have 100% of the risk, you mitigate it, so you have 80% that's accounted for. The residual is going to be the leftover 20%. And with that, you can either mitigate it some more, you can transfer it, accept it. And again, rejecting, for the test, it may be a possibility, but in real life, by rejecting it, you're accepting the risk. So that is the only option. You need to know the importance of background checks on individuals. Probably going to cover that a little bit more later, but definitely very important because, again, if you're a financial institution and you hire somebody with an embezzlement background, that could be a very big problem. Okay. Need to know the CPU, data pass-off, the difference between primary memory, real memory, cache, and virtual memory. And again, real memory, its memory segments are available to others to use. Cached is a buffer that increases the overall performance. And then virtual is a combination of real and secondary storage. So basically, again, your page file.sys, again on Vista, you're going to have your USB capability as well. And the page file.sys is definitely a good one to use when it comes down to like forensics type information. Chances are you're probably not going to find much useful information, but you definitely could find things like crypto keys or user account information. Okay, basically just know what a data bus is. The different states are also important, such as stopped, waiting, running, and then ready. Multi-core versus multitasking, multiprocessing, and multiprogramming. The primary ones that a lot of people get thrown on a loop on is the difference between multitasking and multiprocessing. Multiprocessing is actually multiple processors, and then multitasking is multiple programs running at the same time.
So, by definition, quad core is still one CPU, right?
It could be, where you can have multiple CPUs and then just, yeah, but yeah, usually. And then they segment things off. Well, that is multiprocessing, but you could also be multi-threading within each CPU of the multiprocessor, all running multiple cores. So.
But multitasking would just be like multitasking would be one CPU running multiple applications?
Yes, or yeah. So the nice thing about the CISSP for the technical perspective on taking the test, granted, going back to it is a test on taking tests. So basically you have to be very comfortable with the content, and then you have to go at it at the aspect of, okay, now I know the content, these are absolutely wrong, what is it actually asking for type scenario. Usually on a lot of the technical stuff, they have seemed to be, as long as you know the content, relatively straightforward. However, there are questions on there that are not straightforward at all. They'll have double negatives, so be aware of that. You may come across a few which will say out of all these items, which is not, and then you look at it, and then it's going to be 3 correct answers, 1 absolutely wrong answer type scenario. But yeah, they may try to trick you on specific keywords as well, like pretty much any and all tests that I've taken, especially on the security side. For example, like throwing in applications that don't exist with ones that do exist. So.
Real quick, that first section of system architecture that you just went through, and I'm saying all of it.
Okay.
In general, is it just the fact that as a CISSP certified professional, we just need to know that information about
Yes.
how systems are architected? There's
Yes.
no specific security implications.
Oh.
You know what I mean? What are they? And we need to know that.
When you know the architecture, then basically it comes down to if they're not, or if the protection rings don't exist, then that's a huge problem because everybody's running as system accounts. So if you add the protection rings, then you're minimizing the potential of the user actually getting like kernel level access. So that's the main type thing that they're really trying to push is that, for example, how many people? Yeah.
Kernel level access, then they could do something where they could be writing machine level code and manipulating blocks of memory that other applications are using and all this kind of stuff.
Yes. So that's the main thing to take out of it. And again, with the test, it is the mile wide and inch deep. So they do want you to know pretty much anything that could potentially cause a security violation within an entity. And that's again why they also want you to like physical security as well. But yeah, like with, for example, the multiprocessing, some of the OSs, if you install it, they won't take advantage of the secondary CPU, or some OSs have a primary, and a lot of the things they don't push off to the secondary. And then the 64, like AMD. How many people here have heard of the virtual machine-based rootkits and the hardware the hardware virtualization rootkits? Virtual machine-based rootkit, again, slightly off topic, but tying it back to the hardware within the hardware virtualization. But the VMRBs basically have it. A virtual machine-based rootkit is where somebody installs like a virtual PC or VMware in your system, hijacks your OS, and then encapsulates it in a virtual machine, and then basically installs their own operating system on the base of the system. So now it has full hardware access to the actual hard drive, to all the devices, and now it can change any content or file on the hard drive because the operating system no longer has control over it. It's controlling all calls to the hardware. Okay, and then there's also the virtual machine-based rootkits we just covered. There's also hardware virtualization rootkits, which are going to use these virtualization portion of the new CPUs, like the 64-bit processors for the AMD. There's the red pill and the blue pill. Has anybody heard that one before?
Matrix.
Yeah, well, I believe that's actually what it was named off of, because the believe is the blue pill, is going through and tells you that you're in a virtualized environment. Bless you. And it basically says that you're in a virtualized environment, so now you decide what you want to do from there. Then the red pill is the machine-based rootkit, or virtual machine-based rootkit, which takes advantage of the processor, loads its own content on it, bless you, and then basically, again, hijacks the system. And what's interesting about that is, unlike the other one, it does not leave a forensic footprint on the system because it doesn't install anything on the drive. It's all going off the virtualization built into the CPU portion. So yeah, again, it's the more you know about the hardware, the architecture part, the more you'll know about potential vulnerabilities in the future. For the test is concerned, they want you to know at least the basics, because then it goes into access controls and things like that. So that's what you'll notice, or everybody's probably going to notice by at least tomorrow, and by Friday you're probably going to be tired of it. A lot of the content is going to be hashed over and over because it goes throughout the domains. Many of the items are multiple domain or cross-domain issues, like your access control lists. That's going to be in your system architecture. That's going to be in the access control domain. That's going to be in your software and basically your physical as well. So there's going to be a lot of content that's going to be rehashed. But basically it all ties into the same concept of need to know. If you don't, then you shouldn't have the access. Okay, this is something we will cover a little bit more too, as far as the system architecture. But you need to know, for example, like ring 0, or the kernel level, should not be touching the user level or the application level. There should be multiple rings. If there are only 2 rings, then there's a good possibility something can bounce from one ring to the next ring and then have adverse effects. The TCB, Trusted Computing Base, basically something, again, you need to memorize. Reference monitor versus security kernel. Reference monitor is access control concept, and security kernel is a component to enforce the reference monitor's access rules. It's a physical implementation of the reference monitor. And that's something, again, just need to memorize. Okay, models. Which one's going to be the confidentiality? Yep, Bell-LaPadula. Medulla oblongata. The BIBA is going to be the commercial based, or the integrity, same as Clark-Wilson. Such pretty transitions. Okay, again, the Bell-LaPadula. You cannot write from a higher classification level down, and you cannot read from a lower classification level up. The BIBA, you cannot read down, you cannot write up.
I have a question about that. I went back to reread it in the book, and they talk about the strong start property, which actually seems to reverse. I mean, my brain got tied into a pretzel reading this.
Okay, it's no read up, no write down.
And then the last line, subjects must only read and write at their own level. I understand that, but then no write up and no read down.
Yeah, that I think is actually supposed to be on the next slide.
Yeah.
Because it's no write up, no read down for the BIBA.
But that says Bell-LaPadula.
Yeah. Probably just a copy and paste issue, I'm assuming.
Well, that's cool, as long as that's what it is.
Yeah.
You know.
Because, yeah, the whole thing with the confidentiality, so let's go ahead and cross that out, is that it's no read up, no write down. In a perfect world, except that's going to break a lot of things in reality, you would be within your own classification. You won't be able to exit the sandbox. So when it comes down to it, you won't be able to read what's outside of that area. But then that's basically a caveat system to where everybody's at a specific level and each has their own sandbox to play in. The downside of that is it minimizes the information that you get to work with and sometimes can hinder business operations. But yeah, that's actually supposed to be the next side.
That's cool. I can live with that. That was the answer.
And okay, BIBA, no write up, no read down. Lattice, which is going to be part of the BIBA and the Bell-LaPadula model. Take grant. Basically, either you can take or be granted only the rights from the item that you're trying to take or that is trying to grant from. So you cannot go above or beyond the individual item that has the rights that you want. Okay. Memorize TCSEC. Trusted Computer System Evaluation Criteria. Definitely know what ITSEC is, which is going to be the international standard, the across the pond standard. TCSEC is going to be the orange book. That's the D, C1, C2, B1, B2, B3, and then the A standards. Mandatory access control starts at B, so B1. You cannot have access control or mandatory access control at a C2 level system. And again, the term system is not the actual OS. It is going to be the entire environment of the item that's data is being stored on. So the system will also count not only the workstations, the computers, the servers, but the network architecture.
What would be, like, Windows is which one?
C2. And that was the highest that they have been accredited by the NSA with, is C2.
When you say Windows, you mean like a standalone workstation?
Any Windows operating system. The highest they've ever been able to accredit is C2.
All right, okay, but if you have a complete environment,
Then you,
not like Windows laptops, let's
right.
say that. Let's say your servers could be whatever.
It's still going to be C2 until you put routers and switches and VLANs. So you can make it to a higher level if you put other controls in place. And that's one of the things that they've really pushed as well, is that don't just rely on, they like defense in depth, because a lot of times a lot more stuff is open on a Windows box than is on a Unix box. For example, when you install it, if you do a port scan on a base install of any Unix or Linux system, there's going to be very few ports open. But if you do a port scan on a base install of Windows, you're usually going to see the 135 through 139, 445 on an NT system, and then several other probabilities. And then the services that are running, by default, a lot of times you'll have a lot of unnecessary services in that area, which makes the whole environment run more smoothly, because you don't have to configure everything as much, because it's more quote-unquote plug and play than a lot of the Unix environments, but it is by default less secure, because the more code that's running, the more potentials for vulnerabilities. The more services that are running, the more targets for an attacker. But yes, you could get a higher level secured system by adding extra steps. Okay, TCSEC requirements. Again, security policy, marking, basically labels associated with objects, which would be that the system either A is caveated or it is supposed to be, let's say, a secret level. So you actually have to have your classification level of the individual as well, and they have to be trusted at that same level to see the data with that label. Okay, the identification, the accountability, of course, assurance, which means that everything in place is being tested on a regular basis, and continued protection. Again, this is something basically, it's just memorization. Yeah, just didn't know if you were singing.
Not going crazy.
Or you are, and you're sharing it with everybody else.
So is B1 more secure than B3?
No.
No, it's the other way around.
Yes, and that's the strange numbering system they have, is the higher the number, the more secure, but they start off with A being the most secure and then go the opposite direction. Because D is going to be minimal security, which basically means that you can turn it off or turn it on. To secure it, it's off.
So it could be like Windows, except it's not password enabled.
Yeah, like Windows 98. You have a password to get on, but you can escape and still get into the area, and then just delete the PWL file, and now there's no password. So that would be a D. The C would be probably an ENT system for C1. And then when you go up to, I think, NT4, if you tie it down quite a bit, same thing with 2000. If you go through the proper ways to make sure that things aren't running when they shouldn't be, Active Directory is enabled instead of local security, then you can get up to C2. Okay, the ITSEC. I'm not sure if you need to know the countries involved, but you need to know it's the European standard. And it's very similar to the TCSEC, but it does assurance and functionality. So you need to recognize like the F1 through F10, which is functionality, and E is for assurance. So if you see any items like that on the test, just know that the F1E or the FE is going to be their standard. The D through A is going to be our standard. Assuming that you're now here in DC in the US, that's why it's R. Yeah. But probably not going to need to know the difference between F8 and F9 type scenario. But you do need to know the difference between D through A. Okay, advantages, disadvantages, common criteria. This is something, again, you need to know because we will be covering it too in this software development life cycle. Basically, it comes down to it's the international standard, which combines the majority of the other standards in one big happy standard.
Question.
Yes.
For the test, are they going to throw things out like, what year was the common criteria established?
They should not. I'm not going to say they shall not, but they shouldn't. So
I haven't looked through any of the questions yet to see if there are any.
it's definitely always possibility of specific things making the test, but historically speaking, from what I've heard other people talking about some of the content, it didn't get that granular. But it did get as granular as, like on the CC, the EAL levels. For example, 1 is, or 0 is basically nothing. It goes all the way up to 5, which is going to be high. It goes up to 7, which is going to be the highest. But at level 7, that's not really feasible for most companies. But going up to level 5 may be feasible for most companies. So you need to know EAL is part of the CC. That's one thing that you will find out, especially in this realm, especially if you're in government side or some commercial entities, that acronyms are going to be your next language. So you can basically go through an entire conversation for 15 minutes just speaking on acronyms, especially if you pass the CISSP test. Okay, you need to know the difference between basically a covert channel and a backdoor. Covert channel is being able to use a communications method for something other than it's normally been used for. For example, even encrypting something on a normal traffic. If you use CryptCat on port 80, since port 80 is traditionally used for unencrypted HTTP, you're using a different protocol and obfuscating, or not really obfuscating, but meshing up the data in encryption. So that's technically a covert channel. Or it could be as much as doing ICMP. How many people here have heard of moon bouncing before? They actually do a lab in that class to where you get an ICMP packet and then you spoof the source address. So with that packet, it sees that it's being spoofed. So then, it doesn't see it's being spoofed, but it sees the packet it's coming from. And then with ICMP, it's supposed to reply with the same traffic that's in the data portion of the ICMP packet. So you send it to this zombie out on the internet, it then is going to reply back to the spoofed address. Well, the guy on the spoof side is listening. So he grabs the information, pulls it out of the packet, and then basically sends it back with your address spoofed. So basically you can have a two-way communications channel encrypted. It's a program called Lyceum, basically just bouncing off ICMP. So it's one of the few spoofing communication channels that you can use and still get traffic back and forth. Okay, backdoors, basically some unauthorized way of bypassing the access controls. Technically, a maintenance hook is a backdoor, but the main difference is a backdoor is used for malicious intents and purposes. A maintenance hook is usually put in there by the developer or by the programmer or whatnot, usually without malice, forethought or whatnot. Usually it's, for example, trying to get tech support made easy. So they put in a backdoor so they can look at databases and then fix things for an application and not have to go through the entire process of grabbing the database, encrypting it, sending it over a secured channel, and then opening up the database. Race condition. Is everybody comfortable with that? Two processes trying to race to the finish line. Finish line would be a resource. So for example, there would be the antivirus trying to get to a specific signature list, and then you hit that signature list and then either alter it or even hits the antivirus and then shut it off before it can actually scan your signature. How about buffer overflow? Everybody comfortable with that, with the generalities of it? Basically, you're stuffing too much data into a data container. For example, a variable only is supposed to have 24 characters, and if you put 512 characters in, it of course is going to be higher or above and beyond the 24, so you're going to be writing all the other variables in that area, and once you get to, let's say, 513, the application crashes, which basically means you probably have overwritten a return pointer.
Is that what causes denial of service attack?
Yes, if you do a buffer overflow and you're not able to run the shell code and it crashes the application, that is a malformed packet for denial of service attack. Usually,
So that as well as like a botnet would
Yeah.
be created.
the botnets were more towards the distributed denial of service or DDoSs. Usually, the majority of the DOSs are a single packet going to a system. It's going to be this type of DOS. It's either A, the attacker didn't have the time, or they didn't have the know-how, or they didn't have the space to put the shellcode in and just overwrote the data. So,
What's the part about the attack can cause code to execute in privilege mode?
for example, like IIS 5, it was had some items running a system. So whenever you attack and do buffer overflow on the application, you're going to get the inherent rights of the software or the function that was running at that time. And because IIS was running as a system account, you now have system level access. But if it was running as a guest account, you would only have guest level access. Because basically, you're bouncing off the application that was currently running in that memory stack and then grabbing that from them. So that's the primary issue, is that right there. It's going through and forcing it to where you grab the access of the software that's running. And that's the higher permission or privilege mode. Okay, there's the SYN Flood, basically just something to memorize. It's half three-way handshake.
I didn't get that part, like when you explained it. You said sync goes from the client to the server, and then the server responds back with the sync?
Or what ends up happening is the three-way handshake in TCP/IP is the system A wants to communicate with system B, so they send a SYN packet to system B. System B then, over TCP, then sends a SYN-ACK back to the system A. System A then says, yes, I did receive it. Let's communicate. I am the one that it was supposed to talk to, so it wasn't a fake issue. Then sends an ACK back to system B. So basically, it bounces back, and then once that communication happens, then it moves on to the next segment. With the SYN, basically, you just send the SYN, you receive the SYN-ACK, or you may not even receive the SYN-ACK because you're spoofing the traffic, so somebody else is getting the SYN-ACK. You're just sending a bunch of half-open connections or a bunch of SYNs and not caring about the ACKs.
What's a SYN? I've never heard of it.
SYN is basically, it's the start of a connection. It's a specific packet within the TCP/IP stack. There's SYN, there's ACK, there's urge, there's push, or urge for urgent flag. There's a push, there's also RST and a FIN. RST is going to be your reset packet. So if you ever receive a packet with RST marked, it's instantly going to drop the connection. And that goes back to, how many people heard of the issues with the ISPs and bandwidth throttling? They would see some gamers that were doing large communications back and forth, or other individuals doing large communications. And some of the ISPs were going outside the bounds of their own contract within their user accounts and sending RST packets randomly to people's accounts, dropping the connection, or basically making it to where when the connection renegotiates, it's going to renegotiate a slower connection. So if they're downloading something at, say, 17 meg, the ISP would actually be doing this to try to get it down to where it's only doing a 1 meg transaction or transfer. They did get dinged for this, but they didn't really get in trouble for it, even though it was against contract. So, but then the FIN is a polite end to the conversation. So you send a FIN saying I'm finished. Then they're supposed to send, I think it's a FIN-ACK, and then you send it back, or the RST, saying yes, it's done with communications. and that's one of the things that's standard with TCP/IP. But with Windows, they basically, instead of doing the FIN communications, they went through and only do the RST, so it kills it off right then and there. Again, some of the things that you definitely need to keep to heart are the different type of access control models. We're going to get more granular as far as the difference between mandatory access control and role-based and things like that here in the near future. But you definitely need to know the things like the TSEC. ITSEC is important. TSEC has a little bit more history with ISC squared because the founders and so forth. What level is mandatory access control going to be starting off as? B. Yep. B1 is going to be the one that starts. So you will not have mandatory on any of the C's or the D. And then with B3 and A1, the main difference is basically the verification. Same type of scenario, like I mentioned before, like the CMM process. When you go to 4 to 5, one of the main issues is the verification and proof that everything is as it should be. Okay.